Hello, welcome back, and I'm your host Tereza. You guys know the date, so it should come as no surprise. Today's countdown is Top 10 Scary True Friday the 13th stories. I hope you're ready. Topping our list at number 10 hasn't actually happened yet. April 13th, 2029. Some of you may know by now about that recent Leo DiCap and Jen Lawrence movie Don't Look Up. Well, it seems like we're about to experience a little bit of that reality, as it's predicted on Friday, April 13th, 2029, the most hazardous asteroid to Earth, 99942 Apophis, is set to pass Earth a mere 18,000 miles away. That's a lot closer than any of the satellites we ourselves have put into orbit, so put that in perspective. Now rest assured, because this could be a lot scarier than it is if it was to come any closer, but journal articles state that there's no real damage that will occur. However, there is some potential for some intense heat or even an effect on some gravitational pulls. Personally, the idea that a meteor of any kind could just come crashing into us with no warning and just end it all, yeah, that's pretty intense. A terrible ship captain puts January 13th, 2012 at number 9 on the countdown. It's a beautiful Italian getaway and life is good. That is until the Costa Concordia cruise ship stuck off of a reef on the Isla di Gregorio and began to tilt. Passengers and staff were quick to start moving themselves against the tilt as fast as possible, being evacuated on the lifeboats. However, as the ship came to rest completely on its side in the shallow waters, survivors had to be airlifted to shore by a helicopter. Tragically, 32 people did in this wreck, and a massive salvage operation took 19 hours to raise the ship from the reef where it came to rest, using multiple cranes. The captain did not go down with the ship, he actually fled during the evacuation. If you know anything about boats, it's actually not a joke that the captain is to remain on board with everyone else until everyone is safely off, even at the cost of his own life. The captain of the Concordia, Francesco Cittadino, was arrested for multiple manslaughter charges and abandoning the ship instead of directing evacuation. Next up, tragedy in Evansdale. July 13th, 2012 is number 8 in the countdown. Friday, July 13th, 2012, cousins Elizabeth Collin and Lyric Cook Morrissey were dropped off at grandmother Wilma Cook's house. They leave at noon for an afternoon of outdoor adventuring. Not long after, they're spotted by Myers Lake, and later at Lake Avenue, and then never again. Their grandmother, concerned at their lack of return after a few hours, called family and then called police. What started as a small police search turned into a sheriff and fire department search, but all that was ever recovered was the girls' bikes and Elizabeth's purse. After this, FBI's brought in with infrared aircrafts, cadaver dogs, and they combed the lake, but still no luck. 5 months later, the worst case scenario is confirmed when hunters in the Seven Bridges wildlife area stumble across 2 bodies, who were eventually identified as Elizabeth and Lyric, found 25 miles from where they originally went missing. Autopsy confirmed the girls had met foul play, but that's the farthest police had progressed, leading the cousins to remain a cold case. This case is incredibly similar to that of the Delphi, Indiana murders of Abby Williams and Liberty German, who went out to enjoy a walk on a local trail and also disappeared. And speculation of a serial killer in this region has existed for a long time. Both sets of girls were Caucasian, similar in age and appearance, and both were found in rural areas by hunters. Chillingly, the dates of both girls had vanished. 7/13/12 and 12/13/17 are anagrams of each other. Number 7, a real-life horror story happened in San Diego on April 12, 2012. 22-year-old Brittany Kilgore got out of a bad relationship and was starting anew. She had a lot on her plate and she was looking for help in moving. Unfortunately, she didn't have any friends who could, but she did meet Luis Ray Perez, who asked if he could assist her. He even had 5 of his friends come and help her too, on the sole condition she partied with him for just a night. She needed help and she was newly single. What harm could come from it? It was a couple days later that the body of Brittany Kilgore is found. Who'd Brittany met was not who she thought. Perez had a pregnant wife, Dorothy Maraglino, and a mistress, Jessica Lopez, back at home who acted as SMA puppets and partners. These 3 had concocted a scheme wherein Perez would find and abduct a woman to be used as an unwilling participant. Evidence showed Brittany to be their victim, as her DNA was found in their dungeon and items such as handcuffs in their home. Perez, Maralingo, and Lopez were all found guilty, and all 3 received life sentence without parole and will be deservedly rotting in prison. October 13th, 1972 is number 6 in the countdown, when 174 people were killed in the deadliest airplane crash in Russian history. The plane involved in the incident was a 4-year-old model with no prior history of malfunction. As it approached Moscow at the height of 3,900 feet, Moscow Air Control gave the instruction to descend to 1,300 feet. The crew confirmed the instructions and started the descent as per usual. But rather than leveling off at the 1,300 feet, the plane suddenly lost altitude until it crashed into the ground at 390 miles per hour with no apparent reason as to why. To make matters worse, the plane was only 3 kilometers from the landing strip where it crashed, and at no point were the spoilers retracted or landing gear prepared. The lack of mic communication to the pilots after the descent began also leaves us without answers. While there has never been an explanation for the crash's cause, many speculate it was a lightning strike. But many don't ignore the coincidence that number 5 in our countdown is the Andes plane crash that also happened on October 13th, 1972. While the Russian airliner's victims were all killed on impact, the story of the ill-fated Air Force Flight 571 is one of extreme trepidation. After hitting an air pocket and being unable to regain altitude, the pilot lost control and the flight was slammed into an Andes mountain. The plane hit another 2 to 3 times before settling on the mountainside. 12 were instantly killed, 7 were pulled into Fields Gate before the plane's second impact, and another 4 died at final impact. 29 survivors were left sprawling along the icy mountainside, their plane's white fuselage all but invisible in the snow to any would-be rescuers that passed overhead. And after only 10 days, the survivors huddled around a radio listening to a broadcast saying that the search for their rugby team was called off. Imagine the defeat of that moment, realizing nobody was coming. Well, 2 of the survivors felt nothing but spite. They packed up and set out on foot. With no mountaineer or climbing experience, the men managed to survive 10 days and stumble across a local who alerted authorities to the situation. The 2 men managed to lead authorities back to where the remaining survivors, now only 16 of them due to an avalanche that decimated the fuselage and another 8, so that they were finally rescued in late December. This is an intense level of perseverance, but none more so than being pushed to cannibalism. While it was first met with public revulsion, forced perspective of the incident made it obvious that these men were reduced to a brutal but necessary decision. Using shards of glass, they slowly had to start picking away at their family and friends in order to survive for over a month. Of course, when asked 50 years later, survivors state that they did what they had to, and they would do it again if need be. March 13th, 1964 made psychology textbook infamy. Number 4, how 30+ people witnessed the crime without one person intervening. Kitty Genovese was returning from the bar where she worked around 3:15 a.m. in the morning and parked her car only 100 feet from her house. While walking in an alley to get home, she was attacked by Winston Moseley in the middle of the road that was surrounded by apartment buildings with windows overlooking the area. During this attack, she was stabbed twice, and Kitty managed to break free from Winston, screaming out repeatedly that she had been attacked. This was apparently heard by many neighbors, but only one of them, Robert Moser, opened his window and screamed at Moseley to let that girl be. For a second it worked. Winston fled, but only to return with his face disguised and finish the job. Kitty had lost a lot of blood and was barely able to move, making her unable to open her apartment. Winston found her in a back hallway of her building, where he stabbed her to death and unfortunately assaulted her. The attack spanned at least a half an hour total, and Kitty died en route to the hospital in an ambulance. This event was preventable as it was witnessed by over 30 people. No one called the police or intervened. Interviewed after the fact, the neighbors gave a myriad of excuses as to why they didn't. They didn't want to get involved or be nosy. They thought it was a lover's quarrel. The tragic case became a staple in psychology classes as a way to illustrate the bystander effect, or now called the Kitty Genovese effect, which occurs when people fail to act in a situation because they assume just someone else will step in. Moseley recently died in prison at the age of 81, deservedly. Number 3 in our countdown, April 13th, 1963, we're touching down in Jamaica to discuss the atrocities of the Coral Gardens massacre. The Jamaican government was decimated by the acts of British colonialism, and when they finally pulled back from governing the country, it left the economy, housing, and job availability buckling. The Rastafarians of the time were viewed with suspicion and contempt and found themselves harassed by the authorities often. The story begins with Rasta convert Rudolph Franklin, who became embroiled in a land dispute. Franklin was farming illegally, and the landowners employed the services of the local police to evict the squatters. In an altercation erupted, and Franklin was shot shot 5 times. He was taken to the hospital and treated, but only to be immediately arrested for marijuana possession and sentenced to jail time. By the time Franklin was free, he was a rightfully bitter man. A year later, Franklin and several Rastas had been squatting peacefully on the land in Coral Gardens, part of Montego Bay, that the Jamaican government was planning to make into a tourist-only area, which meant it would become a no-go area for the Rastafarians. When the land was sold to Ken Douglas, who attempted to drive the squatters off of their rightful land, an all-out riot started at a gas station property. The building was burnt and 8 people died, including Rudolph Franklin. Prime Minister Sir Alex Bustamante was visiting the scene along with the Commissioner of Police and head of Jamaican Defense Force. Bustamante's response: bring all the Rastas in, dead or alive. Police was dispatched to Coral Gardens and the surrounding areas. More than 150 bearded men, assumed to be Rastafarians, were rounded up and arrested. The men were beaten, tortured, and some were even killed. And many had their locks cut off in a violent disrespect of their culture. Jamaican government officials have since apologized and put forth reparations to Rastafarians in 2017 for what they incurred that Friday the 13th. Number 2 in the countdown is the Paris attacks of November 13th, 2015. The attacks in Paris are remembered for their suddency and terror. While it's happening in the moment, it seemed that there was no end, no safety, and no place to run to. Functioning in 3 coordinated teams on the night of Friday the 13th, attackers hit the concert hall, a major stadium, restaurants, and bars almost simultaneously and left 130 people dead and another approximate 413 wounded. At 9:20 p.m., the first attack happens at Stade de France. 5 minutes later, an attack happens in the 10th district on Rue Alibert. While emergency forces are scrambling to the first 2 locations, the nightmare's brief pause ends at 9:32 p.m. As a few streets south of Alibert, more attacks are reported at Café Bombière and La Casa Nostra Pizzeria in Rue de la Fontaine à la Roy. 4 minutes pass, and now it's attack reports from Rue de la Charonne at 9:38 p.m. Another 2 minutes pass, and the chaos ensues at Boulevard Voltaire. And then the final blow is between 9:40 p.m. and midnight, when a sold-out concert venue seating 1,500 fans of California rock band Eagles of Death was attacked at full force. By now, the president was in crisis talks with Prime Minister as well as interior ministers, and the president announced a state of emergency through France and a tightening of border controls. Please understand, while these locations weren't on opposite ends of the city, law officials are being hit with all of these events in rapid succession on what expected to be a normal night. They're understaffed, unprepared, and that's truly what was the most scary. November 13th, 1970 left a continent decimated. Number 1 in the countdown, one of the most tragic natural disasters in history happened Friday 13th, November 1970, when Cyclone Pahola hit Bangladesh. Found to be the equivalent in strength to that of a Category 3 hurricane, it sustained winds of 115 miles per hour, and a storm surge allowed the shallow waters of the Bay of Bengal to funnel ocean onto the land. According to a 1970 report of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the surge pushed water up 16 feet high. Devastatingly, due to the Indo-Pakistani friction at the time, it's believed that if either country had known much about the incoming storm, they didn't share it with each other. It was noted that a large amount of the population had no idea the storm was coming, and there was indication that East Pakistani's storm warning system was not used properly, costing tens of thousands of lives. With nowhere to evacuate, people climbed trees to escape rising water, and many were swept away. Research reports that in a 1972 journal, the highest survival rate was adult males aged 15 to 49, which is consistent with the impression that those who are too weak to cling to trees, such as old, young, sick, and malnourished, or females in general, were selectively lost to the storm. The Bahura cyclone confirmed 300,000 people, but it's believed to have taken the lives of 500,000 people, making it the deadliest tropical storm in history. Thank you so much for joining me on this fantastically spooky and strange day. Remember to toss salt over your shoulder, don't walk under any ladders, and maybe kiss your black cats for me, because we don't want any bad luck this Friday the 13th.